Hi, can't see any of you.
I know. Are you out there? Oh, there you go.
There you are. Yeah. Hi there. Like so many of you here, I discovered Dr. Nicole LePera, aka the Holistic Psychologist, through Instagram. In a sea of dime store psychology and one-size-fits-all spiritual aphorisms, Nicole's searing wisdom cut through the noise at a moment when we needed it most. The feed gave shape to ideas we knew in our bones but didn't have words for, and found even deeper resonance during the pandemic, when so many of our relationships were strained by proximity and/or distance. There's a reason why so many of us DM each other these mic drop posts, like, the beginning of healing comes with the end of pleasing. Yeah. Or, love has been packaged and sold to us as a feeling when it's actually a series of behaviors. This is why when the feeling leaves us, we believe the relationship is over. We believe that love is gone. Through her feed, community, books, and especially in her latest book, How to Be the Love You Seek, you get the feeling that she's in it with us, because she is. Workshopping life alongside us rather than flexing from an ivory tower. She balances authority with a kind of vulnerability that feels real and not performative. And in a field that has historically drawn a clear line between science and the sacred, she has one foot firmly rooted in each. Next page. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Nicole LePera, clinical psychologist, international bestselling author, and creator of the Self-Healer movement. Thanks so much for inviting me here to do this with you. It's such an honor, honestly, and congrats on the book. It's incredible. I hope you all tear through it. Part of what makes your message so resonant in this moment is that we're living in a kind of psychological and spiritual renaissance, an inflection point in which only as of the last several years, the notion of the mind-body connection has gained acceptance. And with that, new fields that were once considered totally out there, somatic experiencing, neuroaffective touch, EMDR, psychedelics, as well as breathwork, tapping, and everything else, have moved out of the margins and into the mainstream. Thanks in part to you. Your multidisciplinary approach has taught us by example that lots of different levers can be pulled along our path of self-healing. So thank you for that. And as you say, on the path to being the love we seek, which we'll get to. So I want to start by asking you how you got, we just talked about this in the green room, how you went from New York to Philly as, in your postdoc work and starting your therapy practice to leading a movement of self-healers. I realize that's sweeping, but I feel like, you are the rare person who walks the holistic walk and that you've cherry-picked from so many different disciplines. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. And tonight is so special. I want to thank all of you for being here with me tonight. Of course, not only is it the 150th anniversary, tonight is my first live event in the US. Happens to be, finally, right? Happens to be in New York City, where I spent the entirety of my 20s. So for me, I felt like in many ways I've grown up here. And I had the opportunity to have my chosen family here, Lolly, Jenna, Dotto, who has become such a creative, integral person, really, to make all of these projects happen. And my human family, my biological family, my mom, who I know is here with me in spirit, and my dad, my sister, and my nephew, Aiden, who have gifted me the opportunity to, when we talk about relationships and love, really to have space, to rediscover who I am so that we can now have deeper relationships. So all of you here, like I said, I'm so grateful to be alongside of you. I truly believe that in the cycle breaking we are doing, embracing these new concepts, in my opinion, we are quite literally healing the world. So I'm honored to be here alongside all of you. My journey here, I would have never imagined a decade ago when I was living in New York City that I would have the opportunity to write books, to speak in this way, because quite honestly, what I learned and am now speaking about is something that I didn't learn in my training program. And it left me feeling, as a human, really disempowered, unable to create change, stuck in many relationship cycles, stuck feeling all-consuming anxiety. Those 20s for me were really high anxiety, a lot of panic. And until I understood, I felt really disempowered as a clinician. In my private practice, I continued to work with people, a lot of couples, a lot of families that were feeling just as disempowered, repeating cycles no matter how much that they wanted to create change. So for me, it was a journey of learning, of understanding the important role that our body plays, our subconscious mind, all of these habits and patterns that we continue to repeat and really solve. Of course, it's important, I think, to have a safe place to talk about our concerns, talk about our issues, talk about our problems, though it's equally as important to learn the practical tools to be able to make the new choices to actually be able to create change. And that journey of personal empowerment, and then my hope is to, by speaking, by teaching, by writing books, to give you all the information to transform your own lives.
And to the point of, the transformation from your early years of being the overachiever, and, that you write about in both books, in all books, the sort of the ego story that one is defined by sort of the good girl, being the good girl. How hard was that to, in this, even just the professional metamorphosis, how hard was it to kind of shed the I'm supposed to do this, and this is, I've strayed from my path?
The only way I knew myself for decades of my life was through what I did, whether it was the endless box of achievements. My dad, a running joke in my family was, are you ever going to finish school? Or are you ever going to, stop learning? And gathering letters after my name. And that really was the embodiment of this idea that I was what I did. Mm-hmm. And I repeated very similar patterns in my personal relationships, where I always, or so I thought, prided myself on being what I thought was this selfless, right? The good daughter, the good sister, the good partner, minimizing all of the needs that I had had. So these patterns ran for me very deep. I think, as is the case for a lot of us, we have identities, whether that's in our personal life, in our relationships, right? I was the person who didn't bring stress to my relationship. Some of you might be the caretaker in your relationships, and this is how we come to know ourselves. And then I had my professional identity. Right? I was the traditional therapist. I had the private practice. I went to 10 years of schooling to create the opportunity to do this thing that I thought would be what I had done forever. So when I say the transition and healing journey for me was a shedding and a true embodiment of removing the layers of conditioning, making choices that were very difficult, very scary in a lot of ways. What will my fellow professionals think of me as I begin to talk about this holistic world, the importance of our body and somatic, exercises, and what will my relationships think of me? These people have come to expect of me this one thing, and if I stop playing that role, will they love me still? Will they still want to be connected to me? So I am, and continue to be challenged, I think, as I continue to heal, get even more connected with, my deeper self, my purpose, my passion. And I think, as a lot of us do, it's mourning, grieving, shedding, and embracing change, which, as humans, while we can change, it's very uncomfortable for many of us to walk into that unknown.
You talk, we understand in broad strokes that our early relationships with parents and caregivers obviously impact our adult relationships. I think that what people don't think about is how our brain cells and how they talk to each other change because of those early attachments or non-attachments. Talk to us a little bit about that. You get deep into that in this book.
As humans, we're born not yet fully developed. Our nervous system is developing. We now know well into our 20s, and we are dependent physiologically on a caregiver to show up and show some level of care enough for us to sustain life. So in this developmental stage on which we're looking to someone else to make sure that we can stay connected enough and they will show up in service of meeting our needs to at least some extent, our nervous system begins to imprint everything from how we think about ourselves, what we believe about ourselves, that is directly impacted by what we were made to think or believe about ourselves, often as children, how we navigate or express our emotions, which is directly then impacted by how attuned emotionally our caregivers were, how consistently they were able to soothe us when we were upset. And our entire way of relating to other people or connecting with other people is directly impacted to the things that we had to do or stop doing to maintain those connections that we desperately needed. So even though we mature, many of us, get such a distance from our childhood, look back and say, oh, I don't want to think about that, or I want to do so drastically different than what I had happened to me. These patterns are quite literally wired into us. And I think this creates a little bit of a shameful abyss where, and I would see this in practice, I would work with incredibly insightful individuals who would have all of this awareness of the things that weren't working and the things that they wanted to do to change, yet unable to create change because these became instinctual ways of being. I think many of us harbor these very shameful moments of, hopelessness for the future. So one of the big takeaways I hope is in any of the work that you meet of mine is a takeaway of empowerment, that change, those brain cells that did wire in childhood are incredibly capable of changing. Our minds and bodies are neuroplastic and change throughout our lifetime. And by showing up differently in small ways each and every day, in my opinion, we can quite literally transform not only ourselves, our relationships.
In some ways, it's, what you talk about in the book is about changing your body, sort of tail wagging the dog a little bit. Talk to us a little bit about how that is sort of, a reversal of everything we imagine, that you change your mind with your mind.
Our mind is very powerful. I've been fascinated with the mind as long as I can remember. I think it's what drove me into wanting to be a psychologist. Wow, the mind is so powerful. Look at all this beautiful creation. I think any of us who have tried to use affirmations or overpower, right, just think our way to feeling somehow differently, and that very much was emblematic of the very traditional cognitive behavioral model of therapy. Schools are, of course, I think, branching out and teaching different models now, but it was really based on this idea: change the way you think, ultimately change the way you feel, change the way you act. And for all of us who have tried that approach and not had success, the big piece that was missing is our body, all of the habits wired into our nervous system in particular. And again, while we're able to create change, not only will our nervous system resist that change because it feels safer in our familiar habits, it gets a false sense of control and predictability. We know what comes next, even if it's the most undesirable outcome that we want to avoid. In my opinion, the reality for most of us as adults is within our bodies, we don't have the ability to tolerate stress and upsetting emotions because we were raised by often very well-meaning individuals who, for many different reasons, from information that wasn't available. I mean, I cite this often because it blows my mind to think about that. For a while, even coming out of my field, parenting advice was very much like you would train an animal. It was very behaviorist, right, with punishments and rewards, and that would somehow shape, children's behaviors. There was no talk of emotions or emotional resilience or emotional attunement and all that our nervous system actually needs in terms of that wiring. To become calm when we're upset, we need an attuned individual who's calm in their own bodies to help calm us down. And then, of course, you think about all of the different experiences our past generations, our parents had, all of the socio and political context in which they were, living at the time. And now the reality of it is there are very few of us that can tolerate the stress of change. We can't tolerate our emotions. We don't know how to relate to ourselves, to soothe ourselves. Many of which, like myself, don't know how to open ourselves up to support and co-regulating moments in adulthood. And it all begins with our body. And when we understand that, a lot of us, in my opinion, can relieve maybe some of the shame of why we can't change, of why we are still struggling with maybe explosive moments of reactivity, or like me, I spent decades shut down, desperately looking for emotional connection, but a million miles away in my spaceship, like I call it, not open for emotional connection. And then, of course, we have the opportunity to use some practical tools and create change, as we say in the field, from the bottom up.
And what is sort of step one? Like when you know what your issues are. You've been through the therapy, as everybody in New York City has. And you, again, you can't think your way out of this because you got to work from the ground up. So What's step one?
I will always simplify change into 2 steps. First step is becoming conscious. Conscious simply means aware, right? Seeing the habitual patterns, the things that aren't working, tuning into our body. For many of us, like me, who are so disconnected, that means beginning to pay attention to the fact that we're in a physical body, that just as much as our mind is sending information down, all those positive affirmations, our body is sending sensory information up, and noticing when our body is stressed. What is the state of our muscles? What is the state of our heart rate? What is the state of our breathing? And noticing in moments when we might be falling down, those older reactions when we're stressed out, and just running on that blind autopilot that so many of us are living in. So first step, becoming conscious, becoming an active participant in the daily choices that we're making, not just letting that autopilot call the shots, especially in those stressed out moments where we're going to return right back to those habitual reactions, often which cause our self-harm, cause our relationship harm. And then the more conscious we become in each and every moment, the more we can then take that second step, which is begin to make those new choices, right? It's creating change in whatever area that it is, caring for our body, taking care of our nervous system, increasing our tolerance for stress or other upsetting emotions, learning how to be embodied when we're relating and connecting to someone else, not just showing part of ourselves or wearing the mask or playing the role that I was referencing earlier, how to authentically connect. Once we're in that conscious state, then really the choices and new behaviors we can begin to make are endless.
So in relation to others, when you feel yourself, you call the sort of the pathways become sort of superhighways when they've become so deeply entrenched. What do you do to stop yourself when you feel yourself reverting either to dissociative mode or angry mode or whatever the default is?
What's important to understand, I think a lot of us, we hear, information like this, right? Oh, okay, when I'm stressed, I become reactive. So in the moments of stress, I want to make new choices to stay calm, to stay grounded, right? To regulate my body or my emotions. And unfortunately, the reality of it is if we want to just, as I say, kind of throw that tool in my back pocket until the moment when I need it, what's going to happen is when we're in that, what I call survival brain, that brain that's reactive, that's focused solely on our physiological survival in that given moment, where we're fighting, we're erupting outward, we're distracting ourselves, we're detaching away on the spaceship like me, or we're trying to please or becoming hyper-vigilant to tend to the threats around us. We lose access to the part of our brain that has the insight, the awareness, and the ability to make a new choice in that moment. So having this consistent practice of body awareness, building that into our lifestyle, learning how to connect with our body and noticing as our stress level begins to elevate throughout the day so that we can set ourselves up, as I say, before we get to that point of no return, to make new choices at a sooner moment. So as I notice my muscles beginning to tense when I get that phone call, as I notice my heart rate beginning to elevate or my breath beginning to quick, as I'm having that difficult conversation with a loved one, the more conscious I am and the more aware I am that, oh, that's my body beginning to tell me that those reactive moments are right around the corner, now I can begin to make new choices. And for a lot of us, the greatest choice that we can make is to pause, is to remove ourselves or to not walk into a stressful experience when we're already overwhelmed, when we're already showing all of those signs of stress and tension in our body. And I think especially in a culture like New York City, where it's always on the go, right? This sense of urgency, there's always something to do. I think those moments of pausing, of taking a moment, are so underrated and will be the difference between having that old shameful reaction and having the opportunity to make that new choice when we really need it.
This is a question actually from a super fan in California, a friend of mine. She asks, do all relationships function as crucibles to work through our own inner child wounding stuff?
By the laughing, I think the overwhelming answer, it seems like maybe, is yes. We form our beliefs about ourselves, our beliefs about relationships, our beliefs about our place in the world, our beliefs about the world in general in relationship. which is, I think, why all of the chuckles, but in reality, why most of us struggle then in relationship. And I got asked a lot, why a relationship book? Why was that the next kind of in your book trilogy? And the reason being, because even those of us, and that question often then is followed with, do I have to be fully healed before I get into a relationship? I think the reality that many of you are living is that we can do a lot of healing on our own and still, as I do, continue to struggle in our relationships, because it's in our relationships where the deepest wounding comes, where those similar moments that bring us right back in time to those early relationships where we didn't have the tools to navigate our emotions, where we came to believe certain aspects of ourselves that then become the filters through which we continue to view our current relationships, and before we know it, activate those wounds and then react to another. And when you have two individuals cycling through those wounded reactive moments, losing control, so to speak, like ping pong or dominoes, what happens, because our body is communicating unseen signals, right? So when I'm stressed, if I'm having a reactive moment, it might not even be related to the partner or the loved one that I'm around, or the stranger even. Their body will feel my stress. And then, of course, if I start saying or doing something that's hurtful outwardly to the person in front of me, then now they're becoming threatened, and their body is going into their reactive stress cycle. So relationships are hard in general. Most of what we've come to believe about ourselves was created in relationship. And when we have two wounded, as I believe most of us are, individuals trying to navigate life, different individuals trying to navigate life with different perspectives, different wants, different needs in any given moment, we set ourselves up for these cycles of either conflict, intense conflict, or disconnection.
And relatedly, how do you determine what's an authentic connection versus a trauma bond? I mean, I know there's not like a hard line, because even in the best relationships, it's hard to avoid the bad familiar.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, we
gravitate towards the
subconsciously.
familiar. And the way I define trauma bond is really a much more expanded definition. What I learned trauma bond is kind of relationship with one who violates or abuses, where we do feel conflicted and in need or in love or connected to that individual. And I think it can look much more expansive than that. I believe a trauma bond really is all of the dysfunctional ways that we've learned to relate, and some of the ways that we know if we're repeating dysfunctional habits in our relationships, or if we're in a trauma bond, or really if our children or our childhood or childhood relationships are impacting our current ones, is if we feel numb and disconnected, right? Or if on the other side of that, we have these explosive, right, reactive moments where we gravitate, or we almost feel like we yearn for intensity or chaos, and there's the high highs and the low lows, and then the passionate make-up sex afterward. I think it also looks like continuing to pursue unavailable partners, the other side of that, jumping from relationship to relationship ourselves. It looks like a sense of numbness or a lack of connection or a lack of fulfillment in our relationship. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we carry the habits of our childhood into our current relationships, which I think I define as trauma bonding. And so knowing we're in an authentic relationship, talking about the other side of that, is feeling calm, grounded, at peace. Of course, there's differences of opinion in moments. I think sometimes we think that an authentic relationship means no conflict at all. That's, I don't think, the case. It's learning how to navigate those moments of difference, being curious about another's perspective, being able to hold what their wants or their needs might be in mind, negotiating, for a future that makes sense for both people. And essentially just being able to be ourselves, feeling safe and secure to be who we are and express whatever that is in any given moment. At the same time, creating that safety and the security for someone else to be who they are in all of their difference.
I think, I'm sure you've heard a lot in your practice and in your life, people say, it shouldn't be this hard. How do you respond to that?
I think this is one of those areas where, many of us have, a lot of the learning outside of our early relationships and our families that many of us have kind of absorbed is through what we learn or see on television. I think this is one of those areas, along with this idea that there's an ideal partner.
The one and only.
We get fed
Right.
these ideas and then believe it to be true. And, hard to the extent of, like I was saying, we're different, right? In any given moment, two people will have a different experience of the same event. Two people might have different needs in any given moment or desires for what happens. And so those moments, while we need moments to be connected to people, we are interpersonal creatures, as we say, which simply means, one of the greatest ways we've gained such success as a species is to learn how to relate to another individual, to learn how to care enough about someone else where we're able to make the greater good top of mind as opposed to the individual, though that doesn't mean that those moments don't come without disagreement, without, and I think this is another hand in hand with this idea is that relationships need to be equal at all times in any given moment, right? This kind of transactional tit for tat. I know a lot of us, myself included, we like to bring it up in arguments. Well, I'm not doing this because you didn't do that. And again, the reality, what makes relationships hard, so to speak, is that there are seasons or moments where you might be on the receiving end of support or having your needs met in any given area. And then there might be other moments where you're on the giving end of the support or of service to another. And I do think that not only are we wired to connect, we're wired to care, in my opinion, about other people. We're wired to be of service to other people, though when we're doing it to people who are different and joining together, especially I think as society has evolved out of the living, in kind of groups in a way where support came easier, where it was kind of the village model of raising children, of, dividing labor up. I think as we have become more individualized just in our external circumstances, we then see difference, I think, in other people and feel more at odds, making then relationships feel harder to navigate. Because when we see difference and we're focused on difference, what happens within our nervous system is we feel threatened by what we're seeing as difference in another person. Though I do think we all have the capacity, and one of my greatest hopes as a takeaway for this book in particular is to learn how to reconnect with the heart. I believe the heart is the particular, very powerful organ in our body that allows us to care and be compassionate to other people. So while differences and hard moments will be a part of relationship, so will the possibility for care, compassion, and connection.
And we think of heart in sort of the metaphorical sense, but there is a kind of physiological signature that is important. Like you talk about the however many thousands of neurons and whatever that are, that it is, that it is creating energy that we can't discount.
Learning about, I'm a scientist at heart. I love a learner and a scientist at heart. And when I went to what I call YouTube University, and I learned about the body and the nervous system and all of this stuff that I've been talking about, and then I met, in particular, the incredible science at Heart Math. I don't know if any of you are familiar, is putting out, really documenting the power of the heart. Because again, coming from a field who praised the power of the brain is incredibly powerful. Those unseen signals that our nervous system is sending out, our brain is sending it out as well, impacting those others around us and gathering information. When I learned that our heart is doing that at such a greater distance than even our brain, I became fascinated with learning more about the heart and the power that it has not only to impact the way others feel around us, creating the opportunity for them to feel safer and more secure when we're grounded. It also has incredible power to begin to synchronize the way our brains and all of our internal systems are working, creating not only physical health, creating emotional health. And I got really then fascinated in my own relationship with my heart and how connected I was or wasn't. And one of these concepts I think that I read about that sounded like a really nice theoretical thing was this idea of intuition. And the scientist in me always wanted to where is that? Where does that intuition live? And as I started to learn more about the heart, I started to get a sense that this is where these intuitive signals live, because it's gaining information about the environment, so it will instinctually, the more we're connected to our heart, begin to direct us in terms of what is safe for us, what is unsafe for us. I think it's not only kind of a geographical guidance system. I think it really is where our purpose live, our passion live. And as I discovered in my early 30s how disconnected I was from my body, I started to, become more aware then of why I felt so disconnected from my life. Not only was I disconnected from my emotions, but I was making these decisions based on these external ideas of success and of happiness. And for decades, I thought things like purpose and passion weren't something that I had on this. I would read about people who had purpose and passion and these things that are generated from somewhere deep inside, and I thought, that doesn't apply to me. Now I started to have some language with why I never felt like it applied to me, because I was never looking inward. I didn't feel, quite honestly, safe to be in my body, to look inward, to listen to my heart. And in the moments where I might have had an instinct of what my heart was saying or wanting or needing, I would completely override it in any given moment in fear of what other people would think or how they would react to me responding to that deeper place. So the theory, the concept became a practical practice now in my own life of making moments throughout the day to really listen to what it is that I want, what I desire, what's lighting me up, whether it's in my personal relationship or in my professional one. And it's not only been able to shift the signals that I've been sending other people, feeling much more safe and secure in myself, it's really created a path forward for me to have the opportunity to do something like this now, which is what I truly believe is my purpose, my passion, is sharing what I'm learning, sharing this information in hopes that it is of service to all of you to utilize it and to tap into your hearts yourself.
And in terms of ego stories, because there's a huge section in the book on that. The ego gets a bad rap in the world. It's sort of, the goal of so much of the work that everybody probably in this room is doing is, let's shed those ego stories that we told ourselves in order to protect ourselves, from a young age. Two parts. How do you begin to challenge the underlying ego story, and when is the ego useful?
The ego, I think, is inherently useful. It is and has been playing a protective role. The ego, if I really simplify it in definition, it is that kind of constructed story of who we believe ourselves to be, who we believe our place is in the world, that's created in childhood. And, in protection then of this identity and in fear of stepping outside of it, our ego, this endless stream of narration running through our mind, the interpretations or meanings that we make sense of events that are happening to us, is really in service of keeping ourselves in that familiar identity. Because in that unknown choice, we go right back into those early moments in childhood where there was a very real consequence, right? Where that belief came from something that was directly spoken to us or indirectly spoken to us. So it's kind of this action of protection, keeping us inside those confines. And what I've come to find is, I think quite universally, we all at our core, we have different versions of the particular ego story we tell ourselves. But what creates this whole cycle of playing these roles, wearing these masks, feeling unfulfilled ultimately in our relationships, is this deep-rooted belief that we are inherently unworthy. Because back in that state of dependency, when our mind couldn't zoom out in terms of maturity and kind of hover about and have all of the insight and awareness into why certain caregivers weren't present physically or emotionally to tend to our needs as they needed to be in early childhood, couldn't understand all of the nuance and factors that impact someone's behavior or choices that had nothing to do with us. In an egocentric stage of development, which is very I-focused, the world revolves around us as a child, because our minds are always seeking to make meaning, gain a sense of control even in childhood, the meaning that we'll land on or the interpretation that we'll make for any inconsistency in our caregiving is that it must have something to do with us. We are inherently unworthy or unlovable, so we need to either stop being so dramatic, like some of us might have been taught, right? We're too much, we're too little, right? Stop doing this, do a little more of that. And then we absorb that as the truth and the reason why those caregivers weren't consistently available. So our best protection then is to listen to the messages that we're directly or indirectly receiving, believing that we're unworthy, and then we have our own little flair. For me, I was unworthy inherently unless I was performing. I was largely not considered my emotional needs. So that became the narration on repeat. Everything that happened or didn't happen in my relationships into adulthood was a reminder and happened because of that deep-rooted belief that something about me being me, not being in service of other people, was worthy of disconnection. And then so in our mind's eye, when we understand not only and don't shame the fact that our ego is there to protect us, for me it was keeping me performing, right? Keeping my emotional needs so suppressed because that was the way I was able to maintain connection in my childhood. When we don't shame the fact that it is present for us, thinking it's helping us adapt, then we can open ourselves up to new possibility, right? Not paying so much attention, beginning to question it, and then beginning to make new choices outside of those very confined roles.
And so with that in mind, what does a healthy ego look like?
Healthy ego, and again, none of us can, I think sometimes this is a misinterpretation. When I met this idea of meditation, or even like mindfulness, I think I was under this belief that the place to be or to strive for was to be thought-free. To have nothing going through my mind, to have no ego, so to speak. And not only is that an impossibility, I mean, our minds are always seeking to make sense, to make meaning, to understand the world around us. There are always thoughts going through our head. Our minds can be an important part, they can play an important role in creation and creativity, right? That's where new ideas and everything that I think we are as each of us being a creator comes from. So a healthy ego is not that we turn the volume completely off in our thoughts, it's that we create a separation. We create the opportunity to be that conscious awareness, seeing the internal narration, and then having the opportunity to decide whether or not this is a helpful or adaptive thought that we want to pay attention to or act from in any given moment, or whether or not it's one of those old stories. And then when we have that space of choice, then I think we become empowered. But ego and narration and our internal world of thoughts is incredibly adaptive. I think it's something that allows us to formulate new ideas and to continue to advance.
And so the goal is not to kill or overpower the ego, right? I mean, we wouldn't be able to survive as embodied creatures.
Nor do I think that's possible. I've yet to meet, right, a human who doesn't have some version, because again, those neurobiological habits are hardwired. I think this is something else that as we begin to heal, we have this idea that these negative ego stories go away. This internal voice of criticism goes away. If we're aware it's there, it should just immediately stop. And again, the reality of it is these ego stories, these assigned meanings from years ago will continue, even in my own life, to come up and present themselves. What has shifted for me is I now have the opportunity to choose how much I want to pay attention to it and whether or not I'm going to let that impact not only how I feel in any given moment, but what I do.
And if you were abandoned or neglected consistently as a child, how might your perception, especially in a relationship, be skewed? You know, and I think, challenges that people have are sort of like, I can't trust my perception of this, or I'm convinced of my rightness in this situation. Is that sort of where the pause comes in? Is that, sometimes it's sort of like, are we ill-suited, or am I, it's that question, or is my judgment off?
So abandonment, I think it's important to understand that it goes beyond physical abandonment, right? Beyond a person physically leaving our earliest relationships. It can be having physically present caregivers or loved ones in our early childhood, though them not being able to be emotionally attuned or present to us. And when we have that abandonment wound, so to speak, and because, especially physically and emotionally, one of the core roles of a caregiver is to help regulate our nervous system. So feeling unworthy, feeling the cause of their abandonment, and at the same time, having that survival brain, that limbic system becoming hyperactive, we create this storm, in a sense, where we believe inherently we're going to be abandoned. We have all of the things that we have to do or not do to avoid being abandoned, and then we become hypersensitive to any cues of possible abandonment, which can look like, and I know for me, something I struggled with for a very long time, was any perceived distance in my relationships. Quiet moments, I'd be, what's wrong? Is everything okay? Are we okay right here? Even normal requests for time outside of the relationship to pursue, my partner's hobbies or a different, their friendships or things like that, or when maybe there was something wrong and naturally we did need to take a pause or a little bit of time apart, or when I needed a time apart, any instance of distance or space would trigger the memory of not having that emotional connection. So with my survival brain in hyperactive mode, imagining that I'm the cause of the abandonment, I've done something wrong, I've upset the person, I would go right back into this pleasing cycle of not only trying to hyper assess what could be wrong, but to bridge that gap, because it was waiting for the next shoe to drop. Here, inevitably, it is. Some of us live a lifetime in this cycle only to continue to validate that we're going to be left just like we once were.
My ego story is the good girl, and I was given a time cue to move over, which is why I'm like, where are the cards? It's 8:15. So we're moving on to the audience questions. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Of course.
What do you do to break a PTSD pattern, a thought that constantly triggers a panic attack? What type of therapy is needed to break that?
So for PTSD, I really want to continue to emphasize how much the dysregulation lives in the body, how important it is to create safety in the body, to tune in those moments, right? Because the body, being in that stress cycle, is often what's triggering the thought cycle of panic, of concern, of worry, or of whatever it is for whoever it is that asks, and however many of you have this similar experience. So tuning into the body, learning when your body is in those stressed modes, and then learning, whether it's grounding practices, how to unhook your attention from those cyclical thoughts when they're happening, probably activated by the tension and stress in your body, and refocus your attention maybe on just, as you're sitting there now, how it feels to have your feet planted firmly on the ground, maybe getting up, taking a walk, feeling your muscles, right, as they're expanding and contracting, using that as your focus of attention, your body. I'm sure many of you have heard the senses check-in, right? Another helpful way to get out of our mind. What can I see, touch, taste, smell in this moment? Being in our bodies, but not in that cycle. Breath work for me was and continues to be, as I was standing backstage tonight, I was doing some deep, slow belly breathing as I was feeling my heart rate beginning to elevate, seeing all of you beautiful people out here. And so breath work can be so helpful. And when you notice those thought cycles, or you notice that tension in your body beginning to slow, beginning to deepen your breath, and again, continuing to emphasize PTSD in particular is so body-based. Right? This memory of this hyperactive nervous system and all of the cues that activate it. And so getting then very clear on what are the cues, right? Is it certain sounds? Is it certain sensations? Is it certain experiences? And the more we can become aware, and the more we have the opportunity in those moments to be really intentional, to be in our bodies and to help our body calm, so that over time we can shift that cycle.
What is your advice? I had this question as well. What is your advice for young people who are starting their education to be a therapist?
Love that question.
It's a good one.
My advice is, and something that I've gained a lot of value in myself. And I saw this within my schooling. I was so interested in learning all different theories, all different approaches. I didn't stay just connected to what was, being offered to me in school. Because I think, again, we're diverse creatures. And I think the more we can continue to learn and even open ourselves up to theories or perspectives that don't resonate and won't be ultimately how we practice, I think I gained the most value in being open-minded, not only while I was in school, always trying to learn the different ways, even outside of my training program, but post-school. And I think, and I say that especially being within a school system, not really totally knowing how school systems are these days, though I think it can be a little bit of a pressure cooker of one type of thinking. And it's not to say that maybe that isn't the way you continue to practice in your future career or in your future practice, though I think with anything in life, the more open-minded and the more we can try on different ideas, and then dropping back into another second piece of advice is using your instincts. I think something that can get watered down in therapy is the humanity of the relationship, and something that we can do so quickly as therapists is to try to go by the book and lose our own instincts, trying to say the right thing or, apply the theory in practice, and really just tuning into yourself in the room, I think, is the greatest gift that you can give any client that you would work with.
Yeah, and I think this is the beauty of what you do, is that you've sort of, in some ways, not rejected your sort of, training, but questioned it. And I think we tend to get sort of tribal, even within various disciplines of psychotherapy and analysis, or even yoga. People get very wedded to their particular practice, and it's sort of like, well, what about that one? Another great question: How does grief show up in our bodies? What's your advice for how to heal grief?
Grief, again, I think this is another one of those concepts where, like when you hear grief, or at least for a long time when I heard grief, I immediately thought of loss, right? Usually the physical loss of a person, a relationship. Grief is a version of sadness, one of the core emotions, and sadness comes when loss happens. And as I've shed my conditioning, I've really started to understand the expanded nature of grief, how grief can come with shedding of identities, shifting dynamics in relationships, right? Showing up in a new way and mourning all of the old way that we used to be. I think grief can be very complicated in a lot of ways too, where when we do look back really clearly and see all the ways our needs weren't met, I think there's a lot of grieving for our younger selves who didn't have what they wanted or needed. So grief is, I think, expansive, and I do believe most of us as humans, I think it's a part of our human experience is to grieve. I think it can show up differently, as all emotions can, in each of our individual bodies, though when I think of grief, I think of heaviness, right, an ache. Maybe a lot of us, I think, immediately think of our heart, aching, becoming heavy. Though equally, when we're sad, and then my mind goes to, depression and lack of energy. So I think that heaviness can translate to our muscles, to a stagnation. And I think it really does come in a lot of ways, in a lot of forms, at a lot of places along the healing journey, which I think is very counterintuitive, because I think a lot of us expect to, I'm just going to start to feel better, more connected to life. And I think in reality, a lot of us really begin to touch all of the different versions of grief that we've experienced.
We also don't do grief well in this culture. And I think so much of grief is the sort of shame cycle of fighting it, I think that's a huge problem. We don't grieve well. The next question is, can you share the story behind "You make me feel happy," crossed out, "You make me feel safe"? I'm not sure I know what that is, but is that like a secret code? I
believe it's probably referencing an Instagram post. And I think this goes back to these idealized ideas or notions of what relationship is, right? We seek the perfect partner. This idea, even as we talked about earlier, relationships are difficult. No, only relationships are supposed to make me happy, right? Your job and role in life is to make me happy. And I think when we're seeking happiness, not only are we closing ourselves off to the reality of all of the other ways that life makes us feel, and then we close ourselves off to the, as I was sharing earlier, the necessity of learning how to tolerate the stress, the sadness, the upset, the unhappy. I think that it kind of creates this kind of externalized notion of where feelings come from, right? You doing or not doing something makes me feel, and then it puts a lot of pressure on our loved ones or on our partners to show up in a particular way. And then ultimately we send the partner down this spiral of either directly demanding certain things or indirectly, indicating we need certain things for this relationship to continue. And then before we know it, their wounds are activated and they're trying to play a role for us. And safety, kind of making that shift, really highlights what I, again, hope that many of us can unlearn if we do believe relationships are to make us happy, relationships are to meet our needs, relationships are to complete us.
Right.
If we do essentially learn a new definition of love, my hope is that the definition includes safety, right? You create an environment in which I can feel safe in my body, in my emotions. I can feel safe hearing and sharing difficult things with you, right? I can feel safe that even if we have those moments of connection that I feared for so long, that our relationship isn't at risk, that there are those moments of reconnection and repair on the other side. And this, to tie it all together, safety only happens. It isn't just a concept or a theory when you feel truly safe in your nervous system, when you're able to relax and be at ease in front of someone else. And it really is a two-way street. And I do hope when we reframe what a relationship is and use these tools, right, building safety in our own nervous systems from the bottom up, then I do truly believe we extend that safety outward. And as I thanked all of you for Cycle Breakers being on this journey and saying that we're changing the world, I truly believe this is now how we create so much needed safety in our communities, the safety to be different, to express different ideas, to remain connected even in those moments of disagreement. And I believe and I know the power of the heart, and when those signals are the signals that we're all joining together and sending out, it can truly begin to impact all of the world around us.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
That's cool.